Hello and welcome to Baeocast. I am here today with Dr. Larissa Tracy, Professor of Medieval Literature at Longwood University. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, why don't you tell us what exactly Professor of Medieval Literature is?
Well, I'm very lucky in that I get the opportunity to teach my field to English majors and to non-majors. Essentially, in my capacity as a professor of medieval literature, I teach the English majors survey course on medieval and Renaissance literature. I teach gen ed courses that incorporate medieval literature on the broader spectrum of a survey, but I also get to teach the specialty courses in medieval studies and different aspects of the Middle Ages.
Alrighty. And why did you choose to focus on medieval literature?
I've been interested in medieval literature ever since I was a kid. You could actually blame my parents for this. When I was a child, my parents read us novels like The Princess and the Goblin, At the Back of the West Wind. They gave me a set of the Chronicles of Narnia when I was 8. And essentially from there, both my parents and my professors and teachers through school encouraged my interest in medieval literature.
So you said your parents were your biggest influence?
My parents have been a very large influence, but also my teachers. Ever since I was in 6th grade, and my 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Evans, had us celebrate Shakespeare's birthday on April 23rd by performing scenes from Shakespeare's various plays. I've never forgot the scene that I had to do. I was Juliet in Act 2, Scene 2, the balcony scene. And yes, and that was formative for kind of propelling me into studying both early modern and medieval literature.
Now, what has been the most interesting part of your career that you have experienced? Like whether it was while you were studying abroad or studying in the States or just teaching or doing research?
That's quite a question. The most interesting part of my job has been the research I've been able to do and bring back into the classroom. I've been very fortunate to go on field research. I worked in the Isle of Man for a week with Dr. Leela Kopar at Catholic University. We were cataloging Viking Age rune stones, and so I got a chance to actually spend a week with her going through the rune stones through the Isle of Man and comparing it to rune data that they had from other stones and updating the rune catalog from those stones there in the Isle of Man. I've had the chance to go to Iceland. I've had the chance to visit Jesse Baeoc's dig in Mosfell outside of Reykjavik and see some of the early Viking settlements in Iceland. I also got the chance to go to Ireland, and I did my master's and doctorate at Trinity College Dublin after going as a study abroad student my last year of undergraduate from Florida State.
Wow, that's very interesting, especially the old runes and just how well versed you are in this, especially through travel.
Well, it's an opportunity that unfortunately not everyone gets. I mean, I'm a medievalist, so most of my research involves not being in America because the resources over here for medieval studies are somewhat limited. There are major manuscript collections here in the U.S., but a lot of the work that I do requires that I go to the British Library, to the Bodleian Library, and I've been very fortunate in getting funding and support to do a lot of that research. I had a visiting scholarship at St. John's College, Oxford in 2016 that allowed me to be on campus, resident in Oxford for 5 weeks, and have the resources of the libraries there at my disposal, which was a wonderful opportunity.
Wow. So what is a huge pet peeve of yours? Because I know you have multiple involving the medieval period.
Well, I suppose a major pet peeve is when people insist on referring to the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages. There is no such thing. There is the early Middle Ages, there is the High Middle Ages, and then there's the early modern period. And the mischaracterization of early medieval Europe as the Dark Ages implies that there was no art, there was no literature, there was no elevated thought or philosophy, But none of that's true. Some of our earliest artifacts from medieval Europe indicate that they had highly sophisticated artistic modes of production by the 7th century, and probably earlier. It's just, it is a way that the modern world likes to feel better about itself by categorizing the past as something darker and more sinister. I feel the same way when people talk about things in the modern world as quote-unquote medieval when they mean something backward or savage or barbaric. They're particularly fond of using that to talk about torture and brutality. And that's my specialty in literary studies, is torture, brutality, social justice.
I yell smiley when you say that, because that's like the best thing I think anyone could ever like focus on.
Except that my interest in that is not to glorify it or to revel in violence. And personally, I'm very much opposed to the use of torture. And a lot of medieval people were too. There is this modern misconception that somehow medieval peoples were more bigoted, that they were more prejudiced, that they were more inclined to use violence, that medieval people accepted violence as a day-to-day occurrence, when in fact a lot of literature tells us that people responded in a variety of ways. There's no one medieval response to anything. Some people did revel in violence. Some people did exhibit bigotry and hatred, especially against minority groups like the Jewish communities and the Muslim communities. But Western Europe was not some homogeneous whole where everybody recognized a sense of white purity and white exclusion, because it was a very diverse place. There was a lot of traffic, a lot of people traveling all over the known world and beyond that. You have peoples who are going from Northern Europe to the Mediterranean, to the Holy Land, and they're encountering all kinds of different people. North Africa, what is now parts of the Eastern Europe, in the Volga and the Danube. And so my biggest pet peeve is when people assume that medieval means one homogeneous lump thing that is negative, brutal, and violent, when in fact we probably have more violence and more savagery and bigotry now.
And what you just discussed is actually you're going to be bringing it up next semester in your Monstrous Misconceptions course.
Yes. I'm teaching a class called Monstrous Medievalisms, Misappropriations of the Middle Ages.
Misappropriations,
that's right. So there's a tendency for people to misappropriate medieval themes, ideas, and symbols in modern society, to misuse them as a justification for white supremacy and other hate actions, both in terms of white supremacy, neo-Nazism, neo-Confederacy, but also jihadist groups that appropriate medieval Islam. And all of those are misappropriations because they are willfully misusing the Middle Ages for their own ends. And the class will look at the literary and historical sources for that.
That's very interesting, and that's like something I'm super excited about, because we were working on Herod Slaughter the Innocent.
Yes, the Herod the Great play, the Wakefield Master.
Play.
Yeah,
that was like something I know a bunch of us were talking about every time after play rehearsal.
Well, I mean the Herod play, which is believed to have been written by the Wakefield Master and survives only in a 16th century manuscript, but was most likely an earlier Middle English play, has all of the hallmarks of one of those kind of blown out of proportion misconceptions. Herod is swearing by Mahon, which is meant to be Muhammad, but there's no reason in the world that the king of Judea, who should have been Jewish, would have been swearing to Muhammad, and nor would any king who was swearing to Muhammad also swear by idols and the nails of God. Essentially, what happens in a lot of medieval texts and plays is this amalgamation of different groups to essentially create a stereotype, a stock villain that represents all of these supposed negative traits. And that doesn't mean that all medieval people thought that that was really what Muslims or Jewish people believed. It's simply that it becomes a really easy stock caricature. And it's important to kind of look beyond the surface of those texts.
that thank you for like selling like misconceptions and everything, because I know for a while like Dark Ages was a thing. The whole I did read Herod the Great in high school for like I had a weird drama teacher.
I said that's really surprising. I'm surprised.
Like, I read that like he simplified it. Like,
okay.
He's like, here's this, and he's like, and this is how you see an actual villainous character and everything. But like that is more context than like what most people would give.
Well, exactly. And because of course the idea of Herod is he's meant to be comically insane. And you can play the play two ways. You can play it with the gravity and seriousness of the slaughter of the innocents and the killing of young children from the age of 1.5. Or you can look at this as ridiculous, overblown, excessive violence that makes absolutely no sense in the context of the civilized world. And it is essentially a Christian play, so it is meant to be Christian propaganda to an extent. But it also highlights the misconceptions that people popularly held about other societies in the Middle Ages. They were just as prone to misconceptions as we are.
That's very. I think throughout the ages, misconceptions have been like the biggest part of society.
Every society likes to think of themselves as somehow more advanced. Every group that comes before tries to situate itself as somehow more advanced, more civilized, therefore more progressive, with a little p, in terms of innovation and science and thought. But really, honestly, we repeat history every day. And of course, famously, those who do not study history are condemned to repeat it.
All right, and I have one more question before I ask if you have anything you'd like to promote. So, and this is more a fun question. What is your least favorite film involving medievalism, other than Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Well, that when the 1983 The Sword of the Valiant is awful on so many scales, but it's a good awful film. It's worth watching because, of course, you have the beheading of Sean Connery as the Green Knight and the animatronic head that supposedly flew across the room.
And that 80s glitter.
And the 80s glitter. You've got to love that body glitter. There are a number of films that honestly just, as a medievalist, drive me up a tree. And there are films that purport to be renderings of literary texts, which I wish they'd just stop calling themselves Beowulf, because that's not Beowulf. Make yourself a movie if you like, but don't call it Beowulf unless you're actually going to follow the plot of the film.
And you give like a beautiful like hands-on summary of it, and like I think we talked about it in your 325 class about it for a couple weeks.
Yeah, I just the animated version of the film clearly has some merits, but as a rendering of Beowulf, that's not one of them. And I respect the authors who did the rendering. The screenplay is by Neil Gaiman and Roger Avery, and they're wonderful authors and illustrators, but the plot of the poem really doesn't need to come up with a way to explain the dragon. And that is a personal pet peeve of mine.
I mean, I go by Beowulf on so many platforms, hence why it's called Baeocast. And like, I finally saw the movie. Like, I finally saw it over spring break, and I cringed because Beowulf is one of my favorite like literary texts.
Well, and Beowulf is the foundation for understanding a lot of English literature, and it is so complex in and of itself that it really could lend itself to film version. The best film version of that is 13th Warrior, which is a phenomenally well done film, and in many ways captures the aspect of the Middle Ages. It's impossible to do a quote-unquote accurate medieval film because we have no way to check, and it's inaccurate to assume that somehow you're going to be able to capture accurate medieval anything on film. But you can do your best. You can consult historians, you can consult experts in a variety of ways. But if you have a text, stick to the text. Obviously you can adapt it as necessary for modern cinema, but these are fictional texts. You don't have to be quote-unquote true to life because it's fiction, but you also don't have to slaughter the text.
All right. Is there anything, as we're finishing up, that you would like to promote, like books, like common knowledge people should be looking up, anything like that?
Well, there's so many good medievalists out there doing amazing research. As far as my own research goes, I have a forthcoming book, which is Medieval and Early Modern Murder, which will be released hopefully in the next month by Boydell Press in the UK. And that's a collection of essays that examines murder through legal, literary, historical, and medical accounts. And I've brought together essays from a number of different scholars in the discipline who were trying to contextualize this crime that has been with humanity since the beginning and unfortunately remains a constant in our society.
All right. Well, thank you very much again for joining us and for doing this interview. This has been like in the works since like I think last October. Like I've been like trying to like schedule something with you.
Well, it's been my pleasure. So thank you very much for asking.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Once again, thanks for listening, guys, and a big thank you to our guest this week. I can't thank you enough for sharing your valuable time. If you want to check out more content produced by me, feel free to check out Poor University Productions and our podcast, Talk Nerdy to Me. If you would just like to comment on what the next person we should interview is, such in any specific kind of career, feel free to leave a link in that. These podcasts will come out every other week until September, and then we will be taking a short break until December. Once again, thank you for listening. Have a lovely day, and stay special, guys. Bye.